Cetaceans in general are not suitable for captivity. Whales and dolphins of every species cannot thrive in captivity. They are wide-ranging predators in a very large ocean habitat. And when you confine them in a box, in a concrete box, they're going to suffer from that. Orcas in particular suffer when they're in captivity because they're the largest cetacean that's held in captivity, and they are the most wide-ranging social predator amongst the cetaceans. They have culture, they feed on fish in some populations and on marine mammals in other populations, and when you just put them in a box, all of that is lost. I finally saw the 4 orcas that are being displayed at Shanghai Haichang Ocean World. They are in a complex, enclosure complex that's very similar to a marine theme park in the United States, very similarly designed. In terms of its size, that makes it pretty state-of-the-art. But when you think about how these animals live in the wild, how deeply they dive, how far they travel in a day, how complex their social structure is, even though it looks really big to you, it's a box. It's a smooth-sided, barren, concrete box. One of the things we saw today that really struck me as both, I'd never seen it before. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen elsewhere, but I've never seen it before, and I've been watching these animals in captivity for a long time. So it struck me for its uniqueness, but also for what it was showing. One of the females was sucking in the rope on a float, a long line that was attached to a float. It was a toy. She was sucking in the line. She was actually sort of putting it down her throat like a noodle, like you would a spaghetti noodle. And she had it way down there. Her mouth was almost at the float. And then she would just start vomiting her food. She was actually sticking her finger down her throat to self-induce vomiting. I've never seen that before. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen anywhere else, but it's the first time I've ever seen it. She vomited up a great deal of material from her stomach, and then she just let it slip right out of her, because in whales and dolphins, the blowhole, which is where they breathe, it's their nostril, is not attached to their trachea, to their esophagus. The trachea and the esophagus are not attached. So when we do that, we might choke because we might block off our trachea by sucking something down our esophagus. They can't do that. And so she wasn't really risking, asphyxia. She wasn't risking choking herself. It wasn't natural and it wasn't healthy, and it was almost like being bulimic, eating and then throwing up, eating and then throwing up. And she did it twice, so it wasn't just a one-time thing. She wasn't in the show either, which makes you wonder whether this is an ongoing problem, and it really makes me worried for her. And of course the general public probably didn't notice. We were pretty much alone when we saw her do it the first time. I think there was somebody else there one of those times, but they wouldn't have known what they were looking at. And she wasn't in the show, which is concerning. Maybe she's not responding, maybe she's lethargic. So I'm worried for her, and I'm worried for all of them, but I'm definitely worried for her. The second male, the younger male, the smaller male, has a lot of scars, really nasty ones, really deep. They're mostly healed, but he's been beaten up. And it's hard to say who beat up who. So I'm not sure exactly what happened in the past to make him look like that. Maybe the females beat him up because they're the dominant individuals. He seemed to be playing with the other male, so maybe the bigger male is protecting him now. Or maybe the bigger male beat him up and they're now have worked out some sort of détente. I have no idea. But he's been beat up. And then the female who isn't well had a very odd circular wound on her lower jaw, right at the tip. So equivalent to here. She had a circular, very small, like the size of a small coin, quite raw, not bleeding, but not healed. And it was almost perfectly circular. I have no idea how she would have gotten that wound. You know, was it from something in the tank? Was it from something she did in the tank to herself? Was it from one of the other whales? Have no idea. But again, it's a unique wound that I've not seen before. Normally they rub their chins on the walls of the tank and they bruise their chin, and it gets quite bruised looking and quite unhealthy looking, but it's not usually an open wound, and it's certainly not a perfectly circular, small open wound, so who knows what she did. So there's some strange things going on in this tank with these 4 whales. Some things I've never seen before anyway, and I don't know what any of it means. The show looked normal, the tricks were normal, but watching them on the underwater viewing window, we saw some things that weren't normal.
Did you see that there was something in his hand, in his left hand? There was something, did you see that there was something in his left hand? There was some, I don't know what it was, but they do train them to pee in a cup so that they can monitor their hormones.
We went to see a bottlenose dolphin show, which was very typical. There was nothing new about it. There was nothing novel about it. There was nothing educational about it. There was very loud music and silly pet tricks and all of that. The dolphin show was particularly loud. I mean, I could actually feel the floor vibrating or the stadium seating vibrating. That's crazy loud. That's bad for the children in the audience, let alone the poor animals that have to listen to this 2-3 times a day, every day.
You can hear, I mean, think about when you're underwater. You can hear the noises that are going on in the air, but they're very muffled. And that's not just because of your ears. That's because of what happens when the sound hits the surface of the water. It's physics.
Outside of that arena, that stadium, there was an outdoor enclosure that didn't look very deep, and it wasn't very large surface. It was a medium-sized surface area. And there were 5 or 6 griseus dolphins in it. And there was no sign to tell anybody that this was a completely different species than the one they had seen in the show, or the orcas, or the belugas. It was a very odd-looking dolphin. Griseus dolphins are actually not common in captivity in the West, which I think is because they don't thrive in particular in captivity. I think historically they have not done well in captivity. And so in the West, they've long since learned, don't keep griseus dolphins, they die young. Here in China, they're still exhibiting griseus dolphins. They're coming from Japan, from the dry fisheries in Japan. And they're a very odd-looking dolphin. They're covered in scars, and that's natural. But when you see it as a customer, as a visitor to the park, and you see these sort of dolphin-looking things that are just covered in white scars on a gray body, you might think, ooh, something's wrong with these poor animals. They're sick, or they're fighting all the time, and they're covered in scars. And there was nobody explaining that, no, this is natural. There were no signs explaining this is a completely different species than bottlenose dolphins. So again, if their purpose is to educate, they're missing a huge opportunity with this exhibit with a unique species. And I'm not saying that's a good thing at all. It's a terrible thing because griseus dolphins don't do well in captivity. But if you're going to do it, teach your audience something, and they're totally wasting that opportunity. I also think it's interesting that out here there's no protection from the sun, and these are basically deep ocean dolphins, pelagic dolphins, and they have nowhere to go to get away from the sun. In the wild, they would just go deep. They would just dive deep and spend a lot of time at depth and filter the sunlight out that way. But here, they're just completely exposed to UV radiation except when they're underneath that bridge. And you know, it's just not really a good idea for pelagic dolphins to be exposed to the sun like that. The facilities in China that I have visited have all had sort of certain similarities. They tend to exhibit the same species. They are attracted to belugas, for example. They seem to think they're really cool looking or something, and so they try to offer that in every park that you go to. They had a really small tank for the belugas. There were 3 belugas in an incredibly small tank. It was quite deep for a beluga tank, and again, that's relative. Deep is not really deep in captivity, but it was deep for a beluga tank. But the footprint, the surface area, was tiny. And these 3 belugas just spent the entire time we were watching them outside of the show hanging vertically in the water because they really didn't have anything else to do in that tank. There was very little enrichment in any of the exhibits. They were very barren and in fact very sterile looking. Like there were these 2 divers on the floor of one of the big fish tanks scrubbing the concrete like with a toothbrush almost. And I didn't understand that. It looks nice for the audience, but it's so sterile, it's actually not good for the animals, probably. There's nothing growing on that piano. That's why I came over here to look. I mean, there's nothing growing on that piano. That is way too clean. That means this water is practically sterile. And that's not good for fish. With fish, you've got to have something, some natural elements to the water they're in, and this is just, almost, like I said, it's almost sterile. There's nothing growing on that piano. I think he's like interested in the water intake there. You know, he's got his snout in the water's either going in or coming out, and he's just interested in that. But this, yeah, that's really a strange posture. That's not a natural seal posture. They don't normally do that. I saw a lot of sort of agitated behavior on the animals' parts, particularly with the pinnipeds, the seals and sea lions. I'm not sure what that meant. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe they were really active and that's a good thing, but it seemed agitated. It seemed a lot of fighting was going on. Like they didn't seem settled. It may have been because it was feeding time. I'd like to spend more time kind of watching that exhibit and seeing what these pinnipeds are doing all the time, but it didn't look peaceful or content. It looked agitated. So you see there, right? You were talking about how they're being so obvious about the keeping animals from different areas. So you've got South America and China. So they're not even being very subtle about it, you know? It's just really obvious. In the West, I think they're slowly, very slowly, evolving toward a less theatrical, less circus-like show and a more educational show. I think they're slowly, mostly because of public pressure, they're slowly evolving toward that model, a more educational, lower key, less loud music, less circus-like show. Here in China, they're still doing the old-fashioned circus show. In fact, the walrus show is a circus show. I mean, they literally have a master of ceremonies of the big top with a circus outfit. All of the trainers are wearing circus hats and circus outfits. Nothing educational, nothing natural even. I mean, they have the walrus doing sit-ups. I mean, that's a completely unnatural behavior. And I, of course, don't understand the Chinese, but my understanding is a lot of the narration is just bad jokes and silly jokes and just like stupid comedy. And that demeans the animals. That teaches the audience, in my opinion, disrespect for these wild animals. But it's certainly not educational. And it's a model that's very, very old-fashioned. It's like straight out of the 1950s or 1960s. It's not cutting edge. They have a lot of merchandise for sale. They have these cartoon mascots. The Orca show itself had a cartoon story. And I don't think that's terribly educational. It's basically teaching children that these animals are toys. And I think it's the wrong message to send. Again, very much like a marine theme park in the United States, they had a quiz, basically, for the audience prior to the show starting. And they asked you know, a question with multiple answers, you know, 1, 2, and 3, and somebody in the audience would, you know, say number 2, you know, that's the right answer, and then they would put the jumbo cam on them, the kiss cam on them, and they would be on the screen, you know, saying, you know, and they would be right or wrong. Some of the information, this was a quiz on orcas, this was a quiz on, you know, the facts and figures of orcas, and some of them weren't terribly accurate. The one that really stood out for me was, they said, how deep can orcas dive? And they gave 3 possible answers, and the correct answer was wrong. The correct answer was 91 meters. Well, that's not even close to how deep they can dive. They can dive to about 900 meters. So now that's extreme. That's when they're really pushing themselves, but they routinely dive below 100 meters. Routinely, every day, dive below 100 meters. Not 91 meters, that's not even close. So here's this opportunity to teach people this really fantastic fact about these amazing animals, and they blow it. They give them misinformation. I find it very interesting that they do this quiz before the show, and they're telling people how far they can swim and how deep they can dive. And even if 91 meters is wrong, it's still pretty deep. It's certainly a lot deeper than that tank. And so they're telling people, this is what this animal can do, and then this is what we provide them. We provide them with this box. And they don't seem to make the connection that what they're being told about these fantastic animals who can do these amazing things should immediately disqualify them for being in that box. People should go, well, gosh, if they can dive 90 meters, what are they doing in a tank that's only 10 meters deep? 1/9 the depth they're being told, which is wrong, how deep they can dive, and they think it's okay. So I think what's the disconnect there, the reason why the audience isn't getting it, even though they're doing the quiz, is because the facility is not educating them to recognize how unique their abilities are. They don't want to present it that way, because then maybe they will make that connection. They don't want to teach people these are really amazing animals who can do really amazing things that we can't provide for in this enclosure. They don't want to teach them that. That's exactly what they don't want to teach them. And so they do it in a way that almost encourages a disconnect, that in fact does encourage the public not to make the right connections. When we educate the public as a nonprofit animal charity, we make those connections for the audience all the time. We work very hard in a compelling, emotionally connecting way that there's a real big problem here. And they get it. So I think the problem is not the information, it's how it's presented. And I think if they presented it correctly and compellingly, making those connections, people would learn very quickly that this isn't the right thing to do to these animals, and let's do it some different way. Let's have big exhibits with high technology and some really cool new, ways of telling children, this is what this animal's like. I mean, I've seen some museum exhibits that are really, really compelling for kids. Kids love pushing the buttons and making things happen. And a museum is a pretty musty, dusty place for a kid. These theme parks could do it if they wanted to, but they don't want to. What you can have is, I think, a performance or a demonstration that in a compelling way, and that's the key, not just, this is what dolphins are like and this is what dolphins eat. That's boring. They have to come up with a way of conveying this factual information that is just as compelling for the audience, the young children in the audience, as their current shows, which are silly pet tricks and circus-like acts. That way, people will actually pay attention and absorb the information. They did have some accurate information from what I heard in the beluga performance prior to the show starting. So it was the pre-show. Not a person I could see was paying the slightest bit of attention. They were all talking and laughing and waiting for the show. So whatever this person was narrating that was factual and scientific and biologically correct, right over the audience's head. That's not the way to do it. I actually think that the cutting edge future trajectory of this industry is completely toward CGI, virtual reality, animatronic, technology-based performances, if you will. They do not need a live animal. And in fact, I actually think that the living animal for today's young child is kind of boring. It was the weirdest part of the orca show for me. Now, I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen a lot of orca shows, so maybe I'm not the right audience to determine this, but it was boring to me. I thought it was really slow and boring, and the audience actually reflected that. The clapping and the cheering wasn't very enthusiastic. It was much louder and more energetic from the audience in the dolphin show because they were in the water with the dolphins and they were dancing with the dolphins. Orcas are dangerous, so they don't swim with them anymore. They don't do water work with orcas anymore. And that's actually kind of boring. And I'm not saying that means they should get back in the water. What I'm saying is, I think you can do a show totally using modern technology, cutting edge, cool, interactive technology that kids use on their phone all the time. And that's what they want. That's what they like. They go to the movies to see dinosaurs come to life. Why can't you make an orca come to life and never use a real animal at all? Basically, I would like to ask the Chinese public to look at it from the dolphin's point of view. Try to think like they must. You're in a box, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can't go anywhere else. They, for the most part, don't have anything to do. The enrichment of the whale and dolphin tanks is very poor in China. So here they are swimming in circles, getting neurotic. Try to think about that. When you're enjoying yourself at the ocean theme park for the day, think like the animals. Try to imagine living like the animals with all that loud music every day. You only go one day. You only go one day and have a good time and see one performance and another performance. They do that 3 or 4 times a day, every day, day after day. Loud music, repetitive behaviors. It would crush you. It would destroy your soul. That's what's happening to these animals. You know, have some empathy, try to see it from their point of view, and question what you see.